Hi, I want to cover something I didn't quite cover as good as I could in the last video, and I want to cover the same topics I discussed in the last video, just coming from different directions and describing it from different directions and understanding it from different directions. So language and the inadequacy of language and this threshold idea that I've mentioned in other videos. So it comes down to the society. I want to go tackle the threshold idea first when it comes to society and understanding, well, if you're too weak, if you're too much for society to deal with, they're almost in a way pushing you away or putting you in a very negative circumstance, or like putting you in, say, a mental hospital in reaction to your very negative circumstance, or too much for the average individual to deal with, so they decide you to throw you in an asylum to deal with you, and that almost in a way doesn't help you in any way, it makes it worse, and that's almost where you're stuck if you're a sensitive-minded person, or you just happen to be incapacitated by some kind of mental illness, say an innate or genetic or whatever it may be. The circumstances controlled you, and you're being controlled by the circumstances in reaction to the negative circumstances that began with. So the crude circumstances, negative circumstances in reaction to already crude negative circumstances that created your existence, it created your situation, leading to another situation. So in a way, the bad can be a boulder rolling downhill, ready to crush someone. And that's exactly the deal its final killing blow, but you have to go through the tumbling before you reach that blow, and you're hitting all these different blows. You get a bloody nose, then you get a broken finger, and it's slowly trying to destroy you, sort of like how your mind can slowly try to destroy you, how this mechanism builds up over time, especially if there's no break in it. So you're kind of stuck, and obviously there's a pretense to this existence, this society that we're living in now is trying to help people. Almost in a way, it's better in the past when they weren't trying to help people and they were just condemning people. Because at least on a general level, at least from what you read or understand from in the past, they were at least more honest. Obviously, they still used excuses, but they were more honest with their actual beliefs. In a way, obviously people are honest now, people are more empathetic, they're honest too based on different standards that we have today. But they're more dishonest because there's more of a pretense. There's more of a pretense happening today than there was in the past. And the pretense in the past was negative, but the negative, the negative, say, like witch hunts in reaction to or throwing people straight into the asylums, the pretense was more honest. And the pretense now is more dishonest because obviously life's a negative game and we're trying to help someone feel more positive. And we're telling them that there's nothing bad happening or there's nothing wrong, or we're trying to help them. But in the end, if they're too much, we decide not to help them. And it's all about helping yourself. Yeah, it's all about helping yourself even though a person's coming to you for help. All they need to do is look in the mirror, right? But the pretense is negative. It was negative in the past, and they were being more honest and more honest with that negative pretense that existed. Now there's a positive pretense that we're trying to help someone, but the positive pretense isn't always true. It's not always something that's going to happen. It always comes down to, you're too much for me to deal with now, then I'm causing someone else problems. But I exist because this person. I'm causing a problem to a person that caused me to exist. I didn't ask to exist. But you didn't ask to exist, but you do exist, and you're a problem in and of itself, so you're part of the problem now. You're part of the problem that has to be dealt with. You're part of the negative game, that you're part of the negative sum now. And there's nothing to do to escape that negative sum. You're part of the game, and you've been contributing to the negative sum by your very own existence. But obviously, it's based on the mechanism that drove us to where we are now, based on an initial cause and an inevitable end. Obviously, so we're still playing in the game, and you're still working within the game. It doesn't matter if you recognize the game or not. You're still working in the game, and the game is about mitigating. The game to the sentient being, based on its existence, is to mitigate against as much of the suffering as you possibly can. And to the game itself, it's about reaching an end. And we're working within that crude mechanism of trying to reach an end based on these crude forces inevitably leading to some kind of end. And to this equilibrium idea I want to mention, too, is just because, say, evolutionarily speaking, you give up eyesight because you have a strong sense of smell. Or you have a strong sense of sight because you didn't need any smell, so the sight comes from, or like idiot savants that have the idea of where the brain process goes in one direction as opposed to taking away all these different brain processes that they have, and it goes into one sense, or like mathematics or logic or language or recognition or photo memory or anything like that. Memory, logic, whatever it may be, any kind of instrument playing, finger dexterity, any kind of thing, interaction with and understanding languages, or whatever it may be. It goes into one part of the understanding, and it goes into one part of an understanding, and it lacks in other places. And that almost in a way speaks to some kind of equilibrium, but that you're applying a vague concept to an already existing reality, sort of like projecting your 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 distinctions onto some kind of reality, even though it doesn't necessarily mean it exists. Obviously, there's things like you can apply to certain circumstances, but as an overall circumstance, just because life is predetermined, and doesn't mean that we're not playing the game, and doesn't mean that there's an equilibrium to the life game. Something, just because things happen and you apply it to the past, it's in the past and it already happened leading up to something. Just the right amount of people died in the circumstance. You're applying that to a certain situation. You're applying a vague concept of some kind of equilibrium, assuming some kind of equilibrium to begin with, and applying it to a situation that you can't necessarily apply it to. Yeah, so you're applying a vague concept of some kind of equality based on what standard are you creating? Because it just happened to be. Just because it happened to be doesn't mean it isn't equal. It doesn't mean there's an equilibrium. The very nature of its existence doesn't mean it's equal. Just because obviously the nature of us feeding off each other, I get something in the end based on someone else's suffering. Obviously, I'm getting something in return for someone else's suffering, and that's how this whole game works: is these interactions and these trade-offs that we have. For I get it, someone else doesn't get it, they get it, I don't get it, I get some, you get some. Oh, it's equal, so we cut it in half. Sometimes you could take more, they can take less, but in a way it compensates in the future because they learn from their lessons and they decide to take that and use that for themselves or whatever it may be. Just because you're applying it to that kind of situation, just because something's in the past, doesn't mean there's an equilibrium to the process of life. You can't always apply the equilibrium concept to life because you're applying some kind of vague. You're applying it. You're applying it based on a vague concept, based on this internal logic that you have to begin with, of some kind of thing happening a certain way, just because it happened in the past, or something like that, or giving up senses, or doing this, or doing that, or we cannibalize off of each other. So therefore, I get some, but he doesn't, but then he gets some that I don't. But then you have to look at it from different points of view. I always get it, and he doesn't get it. I always get it, he doesn't get it. And it's based on the zero-sum game to begin with. And that's the very nature of this thing. There's no equilibrium when it's always a zero-sum game. There's no equilibrium inside the zero-sum game. It's about reaching the zero-sum. The zero-sum would be the equilibrium when we're fighting towards equilibrium. And there's no equilibrium based on the very foundation of this existence. Based on sentient existence, the only existence that means anything to any kind of sentient being. Projecting a fictional character onto something else. Like, I wish there was something here, I wish. We always wish things that weren't here. But it only needs your projection. It needs the pain that exists in and of itself for that projection to mean anything. And your projection has nothing to do with the pain. It's the pain that means something, not the projection, and your reaction to some kind of deprivation. And the hunger is not, obviously there's a physical pain to getting hungry, but say a deprivation of some kind of psychological want or need that you have. It doesn't mean anything beyond the pain and reaction to a specific circumstance, a specific projection that you have of wishing something. The pain in of it exists in and of itself, and it doesn't need anything like sort of reacting and then stepping on a nail in reaction to a negative circumstance or a feeling. I want this to happen, therefore you step on a nail because a nail happened to be there. You just happen to react a certain way based on the circumstances leading up to that. It just means that we have a correlation, a more direct causal thing where we associate more with our emotions based on emotional things and physical things than associating physical response or physical reaction or physical effect based on some kind of psychological cause. Obviously, this is all physical. And the nail going in your foot in reaction to having a temper tantrum is just the same as the temper tantrum in reaction to not getting what you want or wishing for something or some kind of deprivation you have. So another thing I wanted to mention is language. Obviously, language, interacting with the environment, and things like that. So we're interacting with this environment, and we're trying our best to interact with this environment. All we're doing is projecting onto the environment. The projection exists. The projection where I'm interacting with something exists. My speaking exists. My thought process exists. The ideas and words of English exist, at least as a shape on paper. They exist as concepts. They exist in and of themselves on a different level, say, than a tree, but they exist. It's an interaction that I'm having. That interaction means something. Based on this physical interaction, say something like a word, an interaction, say, is writing a word down on paper, means something. It exists now. It exists as a concept written on a piece of paper. It means something, but obviously there's a disconnect between what you say and how you describe something, your thought processes, and the interaction. Your thought processes exist in and of themselves. Your interaction exists. Your perception exists in and of itself. Everything like that exists. Your interaction exists. The thing that you're looking at exists. The thing that you're sensing exists. The interaction that allows you to sense, to perceive it exists. The interaction exists. The thing exists. You exist. Your voice, your language, your concepts exist, but there's a disconnect because your language doesn't always describe the thing, and it doesn't need you to describe the thing. It exists because it exists in this reality. It doesn't need you to exist. Sort of like everything before you existed and didn't need you to exist. Just because you're not there to experience it doesn't mean it didn't exist. But as far as you're concerned, it doesn't matter to you because you don't exist. Or after you die, it doesn't need you to exist after you die. So things are still going to exist regardless of you existing or not. And they still mean something, sort of like the pain argument. It still matters even if there's no one else around there to be a witness to your pain. The only person that needs to be a witness to the pain is the person experiencing the pain. And it means something. And just because there's no one else, obviously a confusion of idea, there's no one else to interact with it, or assuming that some other witness would be the one to help them, just because there's no one there to help them, doesn't mean it doesn't matter. Just because there's no outside source there to help the person in pain, or watch the person in pain, doesn't mean that the pain that someone's experiencing doesn't mean something. Sort of like the things outside that don't need us to understand them or have an interaction with them. The tree in the forest doesn't need us to see it fall for us to have seen it fall, for the falling to exist. Obviously, we can sort of say everything happening behind us is beyond our senses. It's just atoms moving around until my senses interact with it. The wall is just atoms. I'm not seeing the wall right now. I'm touching the wall right here. I don't see it. I can see it out of the corner of my eye if I decide to look in the camera interaction, but the wall is just a bunch of atoms, a bunch of molecules put together based on smaller and smaller things, creating a regression leading to some smaller photons and then atoms and then molecules and so on and so forth, and then different cells, and the cells in the wood making up the bark in the tree and that made up the wood of the wall, and all sorts of things leading up to something. I'm not looking at the wall, it's just a bunch of atoms. My other senses are interacting with it. So I'm seeing the wall over here, but I'm not seeing the wall behind me. So it's just a bunch of atoms based on this the scale of my fingers and my atoms in my hand interacting with something else. Say if my hand were the size of an ant, then it would interact on a different level. But my hand isn't the size of an ant. So it'd almost be a different reaction because I'm looking in a different direction, an interaction with something behind me. So this interaction still exists. It only exists from my sense of touch. And it still exists regardless if I'm sensing it or not. Just from my own perception, it's just a bunch of atoms now. But it's atoms based on the scale of my hand interacting with the scale of the atoms on the wall, interacting on that scale that still exists. My sense of touch still experiences it. You're interacting with things on a molecular level all the time, but the relevant level is they exist in and of themselves. It makes up a whole, and the whole still exists in something. Obviously, I'm touching atoms, and just because I'm looking away, I could be very much just touching. I'm just touching, but on the level that I exist, I'm still touching a wall that's made up of different materials. So I'm still looking away, and for all intents and purposes, I'm just touching something that doesn't exist on this level. It still exists on this level, but it might as well just be I'm touching photons. But then I look at the wall, then I notice that I'm touching a wall. I'm touching something that has a sight that interacts with my sense of sight and my sense of vision. So therefore, it means something more. I can see it for what it actually is, as opposed to just interacting with something that my sight isn't interacting with now. And it's just a bunch of my touch sense interacting with atoms based on the scale, or interacting with photons based on the scale, going through the oxygen in the air and whatever, the oxygen, carbon dioxide in the air, and interacting with something. So it's just atoms with my sense of touch touching other atoms in the wall. All of a sudden, it's a wall that I'm looking at, and I can sense it in a different way. I can see it now. It's a wall to my senses, not just to my touch. But for my senses, it doesn't exist to my eyes. But it does exist now, but it exists anyway, regardless of you experiencing or touching it or sensing. It exists in and of itself. It makes up a whole. It exists as a combination of something. Looking at it from the scale that I'm looking at, my senses interact with the environment. It still exists on a certain scale. So yeah, anyway, things exist regardless of you being there or not, and your description it exists, and your concepts exist in describing something, but it doesn't need your description or understanding for it to exist. It exists anyway, and it's going to exist no matter what. Just because you're not there to experience it doesn't mean that there's nothing to exist. It exists anyway, regardless of you being there or not. So it exists anyway, yeah. So yes, I think that's all I wanted to say. So, yeah, I think that's all I wanted to say. So, thank you, and until next time, bye.